The ranch, a dusty inheritance, whispered its single chilling decree: never touch the ring on the hat. He heard it, felt its ancient weight, yet the glint of forbidden metal beckoned, a tremor of disorientation, a cold dread as the world shifted. He inherited the ranch with one rule: never touch the ring on the hat. He did. Then hell began. Witness the unraveling. Subscribe now. The deed was signed, the ink still wet, binding him to acres of sun-baked earth and a legacy steeped in silence. A silence broken only by the ceaseless wind and the singular echoing command that had been passed down through generations like a phantom limb. It wasn't a warning etched in stone or whispered in hushed tones around a dying fire, but an unspoken understanding, a heavy shroud draped over the very air of the ranch, centered on an old, worn Stetson hat perched on a peg by the door, its brim shadowed, its presence a constant, unsettling sentinel. He felt the weight of it, a pressure behind his eyes, a cold knot in his gut that tightened with every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the dry grass outside, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable transgression. The hat was an artifact of time. Its felt faded to a muted ochre. The leather band cracked with age, but it was the ring, a simple, unadorned band of dark, tarnished metal, woven into the hatband itself, that held the true power of the prohibition. It wasn't ornate, held no glittering gems, yet it pulsed with an almost imperceptible hum, a low, thrumming vibration that only he seemed to sense, a silent siren song that called to the deepest, most rebellious corners of his soul. He would walk past it a dozen times a day, his gaze snagging on its dull gleam, his fingers twitching with an almost unbearable urge to reach out, to test the boundaries of the ancient, unyielding rule that governed his new, isolated existence, a rule that felt more like a curse. Days bled into weeks, marked by the relentless sun and the growing intensity of his obsession with the forbidden object. The ranch, once a symbol of freedom and new beginnings, began to feel like a cage, its vastness shrinking around him, each horizon line a boundary he could not cross until this one, simple, maddening curiosity, was sated. He tried to busy himself with the endless chores of the land, mending fences, tending to the few head of cattle, but his mind always drifted back to the hat, to the ring, to the unknown consequences that lay coiled within its metallic embrace, a serpent waiting to strike at the heart of his inherited peace. Sleep offered no escape, only vivid, unsettling dreams where the ring pulsed with an unholy light, drawing him closer, whispering promises of forgotten power or unspeakable horrors, blurring the lines between waking dread and nocturnal torment. He would wake in a cold sweat, the image of the hat burned behind his eyelids, the silence of the ranch amplifying the frantic beat of his own heart, a drumroll leading to an inevitable, fateful moment. The rule was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by the past, daring him to prove his worth, or perhaps to prove his foolishness, to unravel the very fabric of his inherited world with a single defiant touch. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. The very dust motes dancing in the sunlight seemed to vibrate with anticipation, mirroring the tremor that had taken root deep within his own bones. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that he could not resist much longer. The rule, meant to protect, had become a torment, a constant nagging whisper that eroded his resolve, chipping away at his sanity with each passing hour. The ranch, his inheritance, was not a gift, but a test, and the ring on the hat was its cruel, glittering heart, waiting for his touch to unleash whatever ancient, slumbering force it contained, a force that promised to shatter his world. And so, one twilight evening, as the last sliver of sun bled from the sky, painting the distant mesas in shades of bruised purple and angry red, he stood before the hat, his hand trembling, his breath catching in his throat. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy, and the silence of the ranch deepened, becoming an oppressive weight. With a slow, deliberate movement, his fingers, guided by an impulse far older and stronger than reason, reached out, brushing against the cold, smooth metal of the ring. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound, ancient wrongness coursed through him, and the world held its breath. Witness the first crack in reality, subscribe to see the abyss. The instant his skin met the ring, a jolt not of electricity, but of pure, raw consciousness surged through him, a sensation akin to plunging into icy water while simultaneously being struck by a silent, unseen lightning bolt. It wasn't painful, but utterly disorienting, as if the very atoms of his being had been momentarily rearranged, then snapped back into place, leaving behind a lingering echo of something vast and ancient. The air in the small ranch house grew impossibly still. The dust motes suspended, the distant howl of a coyote suddenly cut short, leaving an unnatural ringing silence that pressed in on his ears. A silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a profound, watchful presence. He snatched his hand back, a gasp tearing from his throat, his eyes wide, scanning the familiar dusty room as if expecting the walls to melt or the floor to buckle. But nothing overtly changed. The hat remained on its peg, the ring still dull, unassuming. Yet the world felt different, subtly but irrevocably altered, as if a thin veil had been lifted, revealing a layer of reality that had always been there, humming beneath the surface, now exposed and vibrating with a malevolent energy. A faint, acrid scent, like ozone mixed with something metallic and rotten, began to permeate the air, clinging to his clothes, his skin, a phantom odor that no amount of fresh air could dispel. The first tangible sign came with the sunset. The sky, which had always painted itself in hues of orange and violet, now bled into an unnatural, sickly green at the horizon, a color that seemed to pulse with an inner light, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and stretched like living things across the arid landscape. The familiar silhouette of the mesas took on a sharper, more predatory edge, their peaks seeming to claw at the bruised heavens, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, now carried a low, guttural moan, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth, a lament or a warning, he couldn't tell which. Inside the ranch house, the changes were more insidious, more personal. The old wooden beams began to creak with a new, unsettling rhythm, not the settling of an ancient structure, but a deliberate, almost rhythmic groan, as if the house itself was in agony, or perhaps in a slow, agonizing awakening. Shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to coalesce into forms that shifted just beyond the periphery of his vision. Fleeting glimpses of something tall and gaunt, something with too many limbs, that vanished the moment he turned his head, leaving behind only the cold, prickling sensation of being watched, of being hunted. His own reflection in the grimy window pane seemed to waver, to distort, his features elongating, his eyes sinking into hollows, a fleeting glimpse of a stranger, or perhaps a glimpse of the man he was rapidly becoming under the oppressive weight of his transgression. The water from the well tasted metallic, bitter, as if it had drawn up not just the earth's sustenance, but its ancient buried sorrows, and the food he tried to eat turned to ash in his mouth, leaving him constantly hungry, constantly parched, a thirst that no amount of liquid could quench, a hunger that gnawed at his very soul. The ranch, his inherited sanctuary, was no longer a place of peace but a crucible, its boundaries blurring, its reality fraying at the edges, pulled taut by an unseen force. The rule, once a simple prohibition, now felt like a desperate plea, a final barrier against an encroaching darkness that had been held at bay for generations, now unleashed by his single, defiant act. He was not merely an inheritor, but a catalyst, and the tremor he had felt was only the first ripple in a pond of pure, unadulterated dread, a pond that was rapidly expanding to swallow him whole. Feel the ground shake, subscribe to witness the collapse. The whispers began subtly, carried on the unnatural wind that now swept across the ranch, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to articulate his name, or perhaps a name long forgotten, a guttural murmur that slithered through the cracks in the walls and seeped into the very marrow of his bones. It wasn't a human voice, nor an animal cry, but something ancient and elemental. A sound born of the dust and the rock, imbued with a malevolence that promised to unravel his sanity thread by thread. He would stand outside, straining his ears against the desolate silence, convinced he heard a chorus of unseen entities circling him, their voices a symphony of dread. The isolation, once a comforting blanket, now became a suffocating shroud, pressing in on him from all sides. The nearest town was miles away, a distant beacon of normalcy he no longer dared to approach, fearing what he might carry with him, what unseen taint clung to his very being. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably, with only the ranch and its burgeoning horrors for company, a prisoner of his own curiosity, a solitary figure trapped in a landscape that had become a living, breathing entity of malice. The sun, when it rose, offered no warmth, only a harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to expose every flaw, every fear, every creeping shadow within his soul. The ranch animals, once a source of quiet companionship, now regarded him with wide, terrified eyes, their bodies trembling, their lowing and bleating replaced by a desperate, mournful silence. The horses shied away from his touch, their nostrils flaring, their eyes rolling back to reveal white streaked with fear, as if they saw something clinging to him, something that radiated an unbearable dread. He found them huddled together in the furthest corners of the corrals, their instincts screaming of an invisible predator, a presence that stalked the very air he breathed, a silent hunter drawn by the scent of his transgression. Objects within the house began to move on their own, not with a violent crash, but with a slow, deliberate shift, a chair scraping across the floor in the dead of night, a book falling from a shelf when no one was near, a faint, rhythmic tapping emanating from the walls. It was a torment designed to erode his grip on reality, a constant, unsettling reminder that he was no longer alone, that the boundaries between the mundane and the monstrous had dissolved, leaving him vulnerable to forces he could neither comprehend nor combat, forces that delighted in his growing terror. His reflection in any surface became a source of profound dread, not because it distorted, but because it remained chillingly still, its eyes wide and haunted, its mouth a thin, grim line, a mirror image of a man slowly being consumed by an internal fire. He saw the lines of exhaustion deepen, the shadow of fear etch itself permanently around his eyes, and a strange, almost translucent pallor spread across his skin, as if the very life force was being drained from him, siphoned away by the unseen entities that now claimed the ranch as their own, leaving him a hollowed-out shell. The air grew heavy with a palpable sense of despair, a thick, cloying atmosphere that clung to his lungs, making every breath a struggle, every thought a battle against the encroaching madness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of his thoughts, blurring the line between his own mind and the insidious voices of the ranch, promising a release that felt more like a final, terrifying surrender. He was no longer just living on the ranch, he was becoming a part of its nightmare, a living sacrifice to the ancient rule he had so foolishly broken. Hear the voices, feel the despair, subscribe to witness the descent. The shadows, once fleeting and elusive, now solidified, coalescing into forms that were both familiar and utterly alien, figures that moved with a disjointed, unnatural grace, their presence a cold, suffocating weight in the air. They were not mere phantoms, but tangible entities, woven from the very darkness of the ranch, their outlines shifting like smoke, their forms hinting at limbs that bent at impossible angles, heads that tilted with an unsettling curiosity, and eyes that glowed with a faint malevolent light, fixed upon him with an unwavering predatory gaze. The ranch, once his sanctuary, had become a hunting ground, and he the sole prey. The sounds that accompanied them were not of this world, a dry, rustling hiss that seemed to emanate from 1,000 unseen mouths, a low, guttural chittering that vibrated through the floorboards, and a high-pitched, keening wail that tore at the fabric of his sanity, echoing the despair that now filled every corner of his being. He would barricade himself in the small bedroom, piling furniture against the door, but the sounds would seep through the walls, through the very floor, a relentless auditory assault that promised no respite, no moment of peace, only the constant, terrifying reminder of his unleashed folly. The very landscape outside began to twist and contort, mirroring the internal chaos that raged within him. Trees, once gnarled and resilient, now seemed to writhe, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the bruised sky, their leaves rustling with an unnatural whispering chorus. The dust devils that danced across the plains grew larger, darker, spiraling into towering columns that seemed to possess a malevolent sentience, chasing him across the open land, their swirling forms hinting at faces, at grasping hands, at the very essence of the hell he had so carelessly invoked. He tried to fight, to reason, to understand, but there was no logic to the terror, no pattern to the torment, only an escalating, relentless assault on his senses and his soul. He would swing a rusted shovel at the encroaching shadows, his blows passing through their insubstantial forms, leaving him breathless and desperate, his efforts futile against an enemy that existed beyond the realm of physical combat. Their touch, when it came, was not a physical blow, but a chilling caress, a sensation of profound cold that seeped into his bones, leaving him weak and trembling, his spirit slowly being eroded by their unseen, insidious presence. The ring, still on the hat, seemed to pulse with a faint internal light, a beacon of the horror it had unleashed, a constant, mocking reminder of the single, simple rule he had broken. He tried to remove it, to pry it from the hatband, but it seemed fused, an inseparable part of the cursed object, its metal now radiating a cold, almost living heat that burned his fingers, forcing him to recoil. It was not merely a ring, but a key, and he, in his hubris, had turned it, unlocking a door to a dimension of pure, unadulterated dread that now bled into his reality, consuming everything he had ever known. The ranch was no longer his, it was theirs, a gateway, a conduit for the forces he had awakened, and he was merely a vessel, a living sacrifice to the ancient pact he had unknowingly broken. The shadows grew bolder, their forms more defined, their intent clearer, their silent hunger a palpable force that drew closer with every passing moment, promising an end that was not merely death, but an eternal, agonizing consumption. The veil was fully lifted. The hell he had summoned now stood unveiled, its true face a tapestry of unspeakable horror, its gaze fixed solely upon him. See the true face of terror, subscribe to witness the final embrace. The air itself had become a living entity, thick with the stench of decay and ozone, pressing down on him, suffocating his every breath, a physical manifestation of the hell he had so carelessly invited into his world. The ranch house, once a sturdy shelter, now felt like a crumbling tomb, its walls weeping a black, viscous ooze, its windows staring out like empty, haunted eyes at a landscape that had twisted into a grotesque parody of its former self. The sun, when it appeared, was a sickly, bruised orb, casting no warmth, only a pallid, spectral light that illuminated the final, agonizing stages of his unraveling. The entities, no longer content with whispers and shadows, now moved openly, their forms solidified into a terrifying reality, their numbers growing with each passing moment, a silent, relentless tide of ancient malice. They were gaunt, skeletal figures, their limbs too long, their joints bending in impossible ways, their faces devoid of features, only gaping maws that seemed to drink in the light, absorbing hope, leaving behind only despair. They surrounded him, a silent, suffocating circle, their presence a cold, absolute void that promised an end far worse than mere death, a consumption of his very essence, a final, irreversible obliteration. He tried to run, to escape the tightening noose of their presence, but his legs were heavy, his movements sluggish, as if the very ground beneath him had turned to quicksand, pulling him deeper into the abyss he had opened. The ranch, once a symbol of his new beginning, had become his inescapable prison, its vastness now a cruel joke, its horizons mocking his futile attempts at freedom. Every step was a struggle, every breath a gasp, his body failing him, his mind teetering on the precipice of utter madness, the weight of his transgression crushing him beneath its immense ancient burden. The ring on the hat, still perched on its peg, now pulsed with a blinding, malevolent light, its dull metal transformed into a beacon of pure, concentrated evil, drawing the entities closer, feeding their hunger, amplifying their power. It was the anchor, the nexus of the horror, and he, the fool who had touched it, was now inextricably bound to its terrible purpose, a living conduit for the forces that poured through the breach he had created. He could feel its pull, a cold magnetic force drawing him towards it, towards the source of his undoing, towards the final, inevitable reckoning. His last thoughts were not of regret, for regret was a luxury he could no longer afford, but of a profound, chilling understanding. The rule was not a warning, but a protection, a desperate plea from those who had come before him, who had understood the true, devastating power of the ring. His curiosity, his hubris, had not merely broken a rule. It had shattered an ancient ward, unleashing a primordial horror that had been held at bay for centuries, a horror that now claimed him as its ultimate, agonizing prize, a testament to the catastrophic price of forbidden knowledge. As the entities closed in, their silent forms eclipsing the last vestiges of the bruised light, he felt not pain, but a profound, chilling emptiness, a sensation of being unmade, atom by atom, his consciousness dissolving into the vast, hungry void he had summoned. The ranch stood silent once more, but it was the silence of a tomb, a monument to a rule broken, a hell unleashed, and a soul consumed. The hat remained on its peg, the ring now glowing with a faint, satisfied hum, waiting for the next curious hand, the next fool to inherit its terrible legacy. The story ends, but the terror lingers. Subscribe to never forget.